You could join us today for our webinar with Dr. Lisa Firestone on overcoming the inner enemy that causes depression. This webinar is being offered as a public service during National Depression Awareness Month by the Glendon Association and PsychOlive. Our nonprofit mission is to save lives and enhance mental health by addressing the social problems of suicide, violence, child abuse, and troubled interpersonal relationships. Our programs are solely supported by donations, and I encourage you to visit glendon.org and psycholive.org to learn more about our work and to consider a contribution to support prevention and educational programs such as this one. I have a few announcements. If you have trouble with the audio on your computer, you can listen on the telephone by clicking the Use Telephone icon on the top right hand of your screen. You can ask questions throughout the webinar on the right hand of your screen, and time permitting, Dr. Firestone will answer these questions. There are no CEs provided for today's webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Lisa Firestone. She's the Director of Research and Education for the Glendon Association and Senior Editor at PsychOlive. She is the author of several books, including Conquer Your Critical Inner Voice and most recently, The Self Under Siege. Dr. Firestone is a clinical psychologist in private practice and a consultant on the treatment of high-risk clients. You can also read her blogs on Psychology Today, Huffington Post, and PsychOlive. And now here is Dr. Firestone.
Hello, and thank you for joining me Hello, and thank you for joining me for this webinar on depression. I think it's such an important topic. So this is our information on how you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And again, the two websites that Gina Carvalho just mentioned, the Glendon Association and PsychOlive. So the first part of this webinar is going to be about facts about depression. So what are some basic facts about depression? It is the most common mental health disorder in America. An estimated 1 in 10 U.S. adults report depression. And depression rates are rising. By the year 2020, it'll be the second most common health problem in the world. So this is not just a problem in our country, it's a problem all over the world. Low self-esteem predicts depression, but depression does not predict low self-esteem. So that's interesting. So low self-esteem, and that's one of the things we're going to focus on, are these negative thoughts people have about themselves, have a lot to do with predicting depression. But depression is not what's causing the low self-esteem. Negative self-concept has been found to be associated with depression, even in toddlers. And this was a recent study that just came out in the American Psychologist, where they were talking about depression in toddlers also predicting depression in childhood years. If you want to look at any of these facts and want to know our sources, these are them. And you will get this whole PowerPoint afterwards, so if you want to contact any of these or look at these sites, you're welcome to do that. So what are the signs and symptoms of depression? Persistent, sad, anxious, or, quote, empty feelings. Feelings of hopelessness or pessimism. Feelings of guilt, worthlessness, or helplessness. Irritability and restlessness, and especially in children and adolescents, this is often the first symptom that we see. Loss of interest in activities or hobbies once found pleasurable, often including sex. So activities that used to be pleasurable to the person aren't pleasurable anymore. Fatigue and decreased energy. Difficulty concentrating, remembering details, and making decisions. Insomnia, either waking up early in the morning and not being able to go back to sleep, or excessive sleeping. So again, one of the things we see in depression is either too much or too little of something that we do need, but we need it in the right amount, and sleep is one of those things. Another is eating. There tends to be either overeating in depression or appetite loss. So again, one or another extreme. And depression can be accompanied by thoughts of suicide and actual suicide attempts. Depression and bipolar disorder are actually the disorders most associated with risk for suicide. So having a major depressive episode, and particularly repeated episodes, makes somebody at increased risk of losing their life to suicide. Aches and pains, headaches, cramps, or digestive problems that do not ease with treatment. So a lot of times we somaticize or we feel physically the effects of depression. So if you're having headaches or cramps or digestive problems that do not ease with treatment, you might want to consider the fact that you might be depressed. So what about treating depression? Only about 2/3 of those suffering with depression seek help. Now that's very painful because depression is, however, a very treatable illness. It is one of the most treatable illnesses, with 80 to 90% of people finding relief. So if you're experiencing depression, it's really important to seek treatment. I think about when we've conducted depression screening during this Depression Screening Month here in October, which we have many times in public places and on campuses, that many people who don't think they're depressed score as being very depressed and really could benefit from getting the help they need. So it's one thing to think about. If you think you might be experiencing depression or somebody you care about might be experiencing depression, it really is important for them to seek help. So how does psychotherapy help? It's critical for people suffering from depression to seek care from a licensed mental health professional who has training and experience in helping people recover from depression. Just like if you had a physical problem, you'd go to somebody who had experience dealing with that particular problem. Medication can be important at times as well. It can be very helpful in reducing the symptoms of depression in some people, and often a combination of both psychotherapy and medication is the best course of treatment. Medication can kind of be the training wheels to help the person get going, and psychotherapy can be learning to ride the bike on their own. And also support system can be really helpful in terms of treating depression. The support and involvement of family and friends can play a crucial role in helping someone who's depressed. So if there's somebody you care about who's in your family or your friendship circle that you're concerned about, supporting them in seeking treatment, in sticking with the treatment and doing the things that the treatment is suggesting that they do, whether it's taking their medication or going to their psychotherapy sessions, practicing skills they're learning in psychotherapy, anything you can do to help support them to keep doing these activities can make all the difference in the world. And if you're feeling depressed, it's really important to seek out support. Where do you have social support? Are you letting people who care about you know how you're feeling and letting them be a support to you? It's really important to let other people help us. So how does psychotherapy help people recover from depression? It can help people to pinpoint the life problems that are contributing to their depression and help them understand which aspects of those problems may be able to solve or improve. You know, I often think of the Serenity Prayer, you know, give me the wisdom to know the difference between the things I can change and not change. I'm not quoting it exactly here, but, you know, and really try to change the things that you can and know the things that you can't. To be able to identify negative or distorted thinking patterns that contribute to feelings of hopelessness and helplessness that accompany depression. So often how we see the world is not just based on the things that happen to us, but this negative filter through which we see the world at times. And when we're seeing the world through that filter, our world goes from looking, you know, our glass goes from looking half full to half empty. You know, things that looked okay one day don't look so okay the next day. And when we're looking through that filter, we're going to get more depressed. And as that filter takes more and more control over us, we're going to get more and more depressed. Psychotherapy can also explore other learned thoughts and behaviors that create problems and contribute to depression. So are there thoughts that you have chronically, repeatedly, negative thoughts that may be contributing to that depression? And are there behaviors that you're doing that may be sabotaging yourself that are contributing to the depression? And it helps people to regain a sense of control and pleasure in life. So again, those activities that used to be pleasurable start to be pleasurable again. We start to be able to enjoy the things we used to love to do. So how is having a support system helpful for treating depression? A support system can help encourage a depressed loved one to stick with treatment, because often when we're in treatment, we're going to have days where it looks like it's really helping and some days where we're feeling sort of depressed or cynical about it even and thinking maybe it won't help. And our loved ones can help us stick with it when we're feeling that way. Supportive friends and family can also help a depressed person practice the coping techniques and problem-solving skills that they're learning through psychotherapy. And family or marital therapy can be beneficial in bringing together all the individuals affected by the depression and helping them learn ways to cope. Because if this is somebody really close to you, a marital partner, a very close friend, a sibling, it could be really affecting your life as well as their life that they're depressed. And that's why sometimes marital or family therapy can be really helpful to impact everybody in the system who's being impacted, and also to help repair or deal with any problems in those relationships that may be contributing to the depression as well. So with that, I'm going to launch the first poll. Have you or someone close to you experience depression. So give me a minute to launch this. And if you're watching this as a group, I suggest that you designate one person, the poll answering person, so that you can get your answers in time for them to be part of our calculated feedback about what the answers were. So I'm going to wait till we have about 3/4 of the vote in, and then I'm going to share with you what you, our audience, and we have over 400 people signed up for this webinar, have experienced in terms of someone close to you or yourself having experienced depression. And again, remember, it's one of the most common health problems that we face. So with 3/4 of the vote in, I'm going to go ahead and share that poll. So basically 99% of you said yes and only 1% said no. So this makes a lot of sense because this is what we would expect because of just how common depression is. So you are a representative audience. This is a common occurrence to either experience depression yourself or have somebody in your close friends and family experience it. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about those critical inner voices or negative thoughts that contribute so much to depression, those distorted beliefs. Things like you're worthless or what's wrong with you. And this is a quote from Rod Steiger, the actor who experienced a major depressive episode or several major depressive episodes. When you're depressed, it's as though this committee has taken over your mind, leaving you one depressing thought after the other. Part of the depression is as though you're punishing yourself for something. Your sense of self, your appreciation for yourself, your respect for yourself disappears completely. It certainly isn't that your mind goes blank. On the contrary, when you're depressed, your mind beats you to death with thoughts. It never stops. And this is often what's going on in the mind of a depressed person, are these thoughts beating themselves up. And what we're really dealing with here is our real self versus our anti-self. From our perspective, and when I say our, I mean that of myself and my father, Dr. Robert Firestone, that, and this is really from his theoretical perspective, that we have a real self that is goal-directed and life-affirming, but that we, all of us, have an anti-self as well, a part of us that's self-critical, self-hating, and its ultimate end can be self-destructive. Now, the nature and degree of this division is going to vary for each person, but we all have this. This is a commonality. When a person's experiencing depression, however, the anti-self is taken over. It's more than 55% in control here, and it's running the show. It is leaving the person one negative thought after the other, like Rod Steiger was talking about. So what is the critical inner voice? What are these thoughts that I'm talking about? The critical inner voice, as we define it, is a well-integrated pattern of destructive thoughts toward ourselves and about other people. These nagging, quote, voices that make up this internalized dialogue are at the root of much of our self-destructive and our maladaptive behavior. The critical inner voice is not an auditory hallucination. It is experienced as a thought process within our own head. There's things we're telling ourselves. This stream of destructive thoughts forms an anti-self that discourages individuals from acting in their best interest. One way to think of the critical inner voice is as the language of that anti-self. Now, the critical inner voice does two things. It's part of our being self-critical, but it's also, and those thoughts include things like, no one will ever love you. He or she will never care about you. They'll just wind up alone. And it's also self-protective. You're just fine on your own. You can take care of yourself. You don't need anyone else. Don't trust him or her. And it can talk us out of taking chances on relationships, on going for things we want in life, in a way that sounds self-protective or friendly toward ourselves. But then when we pull back and we don't invest and we don't try to get into a relationship, then this other part springs up again. And we think things like, no one will ever love you. They'll never care about you. They'll just wind up alone. So unfortunately, these two parts go together. We beat ourselves up, and this critical inner voice is very unlike a conscience because it plays both sides of the coin. First telling us not to invest in relationships and then beating us up for not having one. So how does the critical inner voice affect us? This internal enemy can affect every aspect of our lives, including our self-esteem and confidence, our personal and intimate relationships in the ways that those voices I was just mentioning do, and our performance and accomplishments at school and at work. This negative thought process affects us by undermining our positive feelings about ourselves and others and fostering self-criticism, inwardness, distrust, self-denial, addictions, and retreat from goal-directed activities. It stops us from going for the things we really want. So what are some common negative thoughts that people have in depression? You just don't belong anywhere. You're a horrible person. Your life is so boring and empty. Don't ever get too happy because the axe is bound to fall. Nobody really likes you. You're unlovable. You deserve all the bad things that are happening to you. Don't show anybody how bad you feel. It encourages us to be secretive about us, and that's why it's so important to reach out to a support system. Who do you think you are anyways? You're nothing. You don't deserve anything. So these are some of the negative thoughts that are, again, coming one after the other in a person's head who's depressed. With that, I'm going to launch the second poll and ask you, do you ever experience these types of critical inner voices? So, let's see. Having trouble? Let's see. This is the last poll. Now let's see if I can move on to the next poll. I seem to be having trouble opening the next poll. I don't know why. Yes, here we go. Do you ever have these types of voices? Okay, no, I got it. So I'm going to give you a minute to answer, and then I'll close the poll and share it when I have about 3/4 of the vote in. So the question is, do you experience these types of voices? Most of them, some of them, none of them? I'm going to give you, again, a few minutes to answer this. These, again, are very common, and it's when they really build up and they start being increasing in intensity and also in frequency that we get more depressed. So one of the things we look at when we're trying to assess how depressed a person is how frequent are these negative thoughts and how intense are they, and how far down a continuum of self-destructive thinking are they, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, with that, I'm going to close this poll and share the results with you. And 30% of you said most of them, 59% said some of them, and only 11% said none of them. So again, these are very common negative thoughts that we see in people. And again, you're a very representative sample of that. And with that, we're going to go to part 2 of our webinar, which is, where do these critical inner voices come from that cause depression? As you can see, they often start very young in life, from our picture of a young boy trying to study. Our critical inner voice is formed from our early experiences. It stems from internalized attitudes that were directed toward us by parents and influential caretakers and throughout our development. So it's what came toward us. And it can be parents, it can be teachers, it can be older siblings, and other people that had an impact on us. We internalize these negative thoughts that our parents or early caretakers also had toward themselves. So if you are a parent, as I would guess that some of you are, I am as well, one of the things that's important for parents as a take-home message from this webinar is you need to feel good about yourself. If you feel badly about yourself, it's something to address because your child will pick it up. And often what we've found in our 30-year longitudinal study we've been doing is that children have very much the same core negative thoughts that their parents have. Even though the parent may have never said that to the child or expressed it to them, the child picks up how the parent feels about themselves. So again, the take-home message is if you're a parent, you need to feel good about yourself. And you need to do whatever you need to do to make that happen. And the parent might think things like, I'm useless, I can't do anything right, and the child might internalize that. I also want to share with you this cartoon by Jules Pfeiffer. It ran in the LA Times many years ago because I think he has insight into how this inner critic operates. So it starts off, I'm an inner critic. I'm not a book, art, theater, film, music, or dance critic. I'm a Bernard critic, a resident critic living inside the head of a Bernard. He wakes up, and I tell him, you're late. At the office, I tell him, you're not good enough. At dinner parties, I tell him, you're boring. When he falls in love, I tell him, you're not good enough. On occasion, he can't take any more reviews, and he orders me out of his head. So I rip off my mask, and I say, is that any way to talk to your mother? Now, it's not that parents want to do harm, but the ways they feel negative about themselves, and in those moments of stress when they, quotes, lose it with the child, when they are scary to the child, which again, many things look scary from the child's perspective that don't from an adult perspective, the child internalizes those negative thoughts, and they reside as this anti-self within their personality. So basically, we're all divided, and we see this as a division of the mind. There's our real self and our anti-self, and it stems from parental ambivalence. Parents are real people, as we all are, who there's things we love about ourselves and there's ways we're self-hating or self-critical. And we tend to extend both these reactions to our products, to our children. It's hard to feel that anything good can come from you if you feel badly about yourself. The positive side of this leads to parental nurturance, but the negative side can lead to parental rejection, neglect, and hostility, particularly at moments of stress with their child. But also, if a parent feels badly about themselves, they may act in ways that are neglectful or rejecting because they're so depressed themselves, or because they feel like they're going to have a bad influence on their child, so they sort of remove themselves from the situation, but the child just feels unloved or uncared about. Now, the positive side of this parental nurturance, it leads to the self-system. And self-system is also made up of the unique characteristics that you come into the world with. Any genetic predispositions you have, the temperament of the child. Any of you who have more than one child know that they are not born with a blank slate. They come into the world with a temperament and a personality. But they're very affected by a harmonious identification and incorporation of parents' positive attitudes and traits. They naturally assimilate those into their personality. The positive parental behaviors like attunement, affection, control. One thing parents need to provide is control and limits for their kids. When kids feel that there are no limits or no expectations, they feel not cared about. They need nurturance. And also there's the effect of other nurturing experience contribute to the self-system. Particularly positive experience with learning with a teacher, or something that makes you excited and have an interest because your neighbor next door does that thing and cares about you. I think about a story that Pat Love tells that's on one of our YouTube clips on Psych Alive on our YouTube channel, about how she grew up in a chaotic alcoholic home. She's now an expert on addictions and relationships as an adult. But she grew up in this chaotic alcoholic home, and she remembers one time when she was about 10, a policeman came to their house, which was not uncommon because the neighbors often complained, and he sat her father down and he said, "How can you act this way in front of this young lady? And she deserves better." And that's the first time she ever heard from an adult that she mattered. And I don't think the policeman thought he was doing some major psychological intervention, but it had such a huge impact on her because she heard from an adult that she mattered, that she didn't deserve to be treated this way. And she still gives money to the police station or the police department in her little hometown because she feels so appreciative for what that policeman gave her. So it's other positive nurturing experiences also have that effect. Also education and just the development of maturing and developing a sense of self. And the stronger your self-system is, the greater the degree of differentiation you have from parents and early caretakers. You become your own person. You feel like these people have your back, but you can really develop into whoever you really are. And in terms of the positive sense of ourselves, there's our personal attitudes, our goals, and our conscience. In terms of our self-system, we have a realistic, positive attitude toward ourselves, not an overly inflated positive attitude. That's also the flip side of self-hatred, by the way, but a realistic evaluation of our talents, our abilities, and a generally positive and compassionate attitude toward ourselves and toward other people. And when we have this attitude, it allows us to have ethical behavior toward ourselves and toward others. There's also our goals, the things we need and want and that give our life meaning, which is very important because the antidote to depression and hopelessness and helplessness is having a sense of meaning in your life. And that allows us to have goal-directed behavior. And our moral principles, our own moral compass that allows us to act with integrity. So these are all parts of the self-system. But what about the anti-self system, or this part of us that's turned against ourselves? It's made up also of our unique vulnerability, what we came into the world with. Our genetic predisposition and temperament can put us more at risk for having a stronger anti-self system. It's also made up of the incorporation of destructive parental behaviors, misattunement, lack of affection, rejection, neglect, hostility, and over-permissiveness, which again feels to the child like not being cared about. And other factors also impact on the development of this anti-self system. Accidents, illnesses, traumatic separation experiences, and later on death anxiety. We believe that children initially form psychological defenses to deal with interpersonal pain in their early family interactions, but that these adaptations that we make become much more etched into our personality with the realization of death, which happens for children somewhere between the ages of 3 and 7. And if you're directly experiencing it, it's going to happen at younger ages. So the loss of somebody in the family, or a child growing up in a traumatic situation like a war zone, where they may see people die, and they see other children die, and may be separated from parents. You can imagine how that impacts on their development. And the core defense that we form is a fantasy bond or an illusion of connection to our parent that makes us feel safe. And in that way, we start to parent ourselves. In this imaginary connection that we form, we both start to punish ourselves and soothe ourselves the way we were treated early in our life. And if you'd like to learn more about this concept, we have a lot about it on our various websites. Either aspect often is extended into our adult relationships. So we may play out a child-parent in our relationships where we feel like a child and we feel like our partner is the parent and sometimes the punishing parent. We may treat our partner as our parent treated us, and we maybe take the adult role there and punish them. But we often fight it out with partners. The problem is when we break up the relationship, we have to take all those projections back, and we have to deal with the fact that those bad feelings about ourselves are within us. We tend to project our negative thoughts about ourselves onto others, romantic partners in particular, but friends and family as well. And even in organizations, when we go to work and we have a boss who we may see as a parent, we often project characteristics of our parents in those situations as well. So in terms of this anti-self system, there's two parts. There's the self-punishing part and there's the self-soothing part. These self-punishing thoughts at their ultimate end lead to self-destructive behavior. And what we found in our research is 3 levels or stages of self-attack. There's just everyday critical thoughts toward ourselves that we all have at one time or another. A verbal attack, running ourselves down, feeling badly about ourselves, that makes us feel alienated from others. Because when we're feeling badly about ourselves, it's not when we feel like affiliating. But unfortunately, if we're in the hold of our negative thought process, isolating ourselves makes it seem more real. It's harder to carry out negative thoughts toward yourself when you're around people who care about you. And this is one of the ways that your support system can help. Being around people who think positively toward you makes it harder to think these negative thoughts. Isolating yourself makes them seem more real. So it's really important if you're in the throes of a depressive episode or having negative thoughts that are leading you there to be around other people, especially people who care about you and think positively toward you. In terms of addictive behavior, it's interesting how the self-punishing part of it works. Once we've engaged in addictive behavior, we beat ourselves up about it. So let's say we've had too much to drink or too much to eat or indulged in some way. It's you weak-willed jerk. You went off your diet again. You creep. You know, there you go having another drink, and you said you weren't going to drink anymore. Unfortunately, beating ourselves up for bad behavior does not lead to good behavior. We think it does, and we feel justified, and we should be punished because we've been bad, we've indulged. No. It's really much more important to think about, okay, what triggered me to go off my plan? How am I going to get back to it? And have a kind, compassionate attitude toward yourself. Beating yourself up just makes you feel more and more psychological distress. And then pretty soon you want to eat the rest of the cake to get rid of that feeling or drink the rest of the bottle. So it's not a helpful pattern to beat yourself up. And most serious of these negative thoughts and self-punishing thoughts is that it leads to actual suicidal injunctions and suicidal ideation. Actions that actually jeopardize the ongoing life of the person, extreme risk-taking behavior, self-mutilation, and actual suicide. So this is where we've internalized the aggressor, or we've taken into ourselves and are now directing toward ourselves negative thoughts that belong to somebody else, negative thoughts that were once directed at us, and that can really lead to very, very self-destructive behavior. Now, what about the self-soothing part of this voice process? This is one of the things that can be really confusing to people because people who are feeling badly about themselves often say, if I could only think good thoughts about myself, I'd be fine. But if we're standing outside of ourselves, still talking to ourselves, we're still in a self-parenting mode. We're not just being ourselves. And that's part of why these self-soothing thoughts don't help. In fact, these self-soothing thoughts at their ultimate end can lead to violent behavior toward other people. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the first of these are self-soothing attitudes. These are self-limiting or self-protective thoughts that lead us to have lifestyles that are self-protected and inward. So it's, don't take that chance. You don't have to apply for that new job. You're just fine where you are. And it would just be too hard to change your life in that way or to take that risk. Or don't go for that relationship. It'll just, you might get hurt. You just protect yourself. And these sound like friendly thoughts toward ourselves, but they limit us and they keep us from going for the things we really want in life. Now, another part of this self-soothing voice are aggrandizing thoughts, thoughts building us up. And these are thoughts that, we're so amazing, or we have to be perfect, or the best, or we're the smartest, or the prettiest, or the whatever. But you know what? Those set us up for feeling like we're nothing. That's a very fragile sense of self-esteem. It's not real self-esteem. And I think Baumeister made this distinction really brilliantly in some of his writing. He talked about the difference between really feeling good about yourself and desperately wanting to think well of yourself. That's what aggrandized self-esteem is. So if somebody has a very aggrandized self-image, first of all, they aren't very well liked by other people. You may know some people like this. They also, it's a very fragile sense of self-esteem, so if they're not perfect or the best, they're nothing and they're worthless. That's the flip side of it. So a lot of people who seem very narcissistic and full of themselves also on the flip side don't feel like they're worth anything if they're not the best and the most amazing and the greatest. And often this comes from having a parent who needed you to be the greatest artist or the greatest ball player because they need to be the parent of the greatest artist or the greatest ball player. Or having a parent who has a lot of vanity themselves, so they don't have much substance to offer you. They might offer you a lot of words, but no real substance. So self-aggrandizing thoughts are also part of this negative thought process, and they very much contribute to violence, it turns out, because when somebody feels like they have to be the best or the smartest or the whatever, they're very easily going to experience a narcissistic injury or an insult and then want to react in some way that substantiates that image, and that can be through getting aggressive. Suspicious paranoid thoughts toward others, which can, again, feel very self-protective, also lead to a lot of bad behavior towards other people, because if we think paranoid and suspicious thoughts of others, it may lead us to preemptively act in a way that's hostile toward them because of this suspicion and paranoid thoughts that we've had. And partly these can stem from growing up in a situation where that was true, where there was reason to be suspicious or paranoid, or where there was things going on that were hard to understand and people were acting in ways that were duplicitous or confusing. Or you grew up in a dangerous neighborhood or a dangerous situation. It can lead to this kind of thought process, which was adaptive then, but it may not be adaptive in your adult life. And in terms of addictive behaviors, the self-soothing part of it are the thoughts that lure you into the behavior. Have a drink. You really need to relax with those people tonight. Have an extra piece of cake. You've been good on your diet all week. It won't matter. These thoughts sound friendly toward ourselves, but if we're trying to break an addictive pattern, they're actually self-sabotaging thoughts. And if you're going to break an addiction, you've got to pay attention to these thoughts that lure you into it. Because if you don't catch on to those, you'll have done the behavior before you even notice that you're thinking anything, because the self-punitive thoughts won't come until after. And then there's overtly violent thoughts. For some people, violence feels like a release. It feels like a way of self-soothing. And it can lead to, obviously, aggressive actions and actual violence toward other people. So that's another one of these self-soothing thoughts that you might not think of. So basically, if you think about self-destructive thoughts toward yourselves, they exist on a continuum, from mild self-critical thoughts that we all might have to very self-hating thoughts and actually suicidal thoughts. You don't deserve anything. You should just be by yourself. You're a creep. You need to have a drink so you can relax. You should just kill yourself. Again, these thoughts can exist on a continuum, and people who are having negative thoughts at the highest end of the continuum are usually having an even higher number at these lower levels along the continuum. Also, self-destructive behavior exists on a continuum. Everything from just living a life that's self-denying, or where we isolate ourselves, or where we're very self-hating, or engaging in behaviors that don't immediately threaten our life but can truncate or shorten it, like substance abuse, extreme risk-taking behavior, all the way up to actual suicide. And there's a relationship between these two continuums, that how a person is thinking about themselves has a whole lot to do with how they're likely to behave. So there's events that can act as triggers for any of us. But how we think about those events, these critical inner thoughts, this lens through which we see the world, influences how we feel about an event and how we're likely to behave. So let's say we have a breakup of a relationship. That's an event that could be a trigger for anybody, because when we feel rejected, we feel hurt, right? But if we think that was your soulmate, nobody's ever going to love you, you're going to be all alone the rest of your life, it's hopeless, you're going to have very distressed feelings, right? That are going to lead you to behaviors like maybe really isolating yourself that are not going to be helpful. But let's say you have that same event, a breakup of a relationship, and you have the thought, wow, that hurts, but you know, I was thinking this was not a good relationship for me either, and there's really some things about it that were holding me back, and I think I'm probably going to do better in my next relationship. If you think that, you're not going to feel very distressed. You may have some pain still, but you're not going to have that overwhelming distress, and you're likely to engage in behaviors of looking for another person because you're having the thought that next time you're going to find somebody better. And so you're going to be more active in your pursuit of finding a more satisfying relationship, or maybe trying to understand yourself, to understand why sometimes you don't pick the right people so you can pick a better relationship. When we have the very distressing feelings, like I was talking about when we think we've lost our soulmate, and we feel like nobody's ever going to love us, then those feelings make the thoughts seem more real, because when we have really distressed feelings, then yes, it must be right. That was my soulmate. right? That confirms the thought, which makes it seem even more real and even more likely to lead to self-destructive behaviors. It's hopeless, it's helpless, nothing's ever going to work out for me. So the third part, and I think most important part of this webinar, is about challenging the critical inner voice. How can we start to combat depression? So it's really important, first of all, to identify your critical inner voice. One way you can do it is by recognizing events that trigger your critical inner voice, like getting on a scale in the morning. I think about a cartoon that a colleague of mine used to show where this sort of blob creature goes to get on a scale, and he's thinking, oh, you're such a fat slob. You know, you look terrible. And he gets on the scale, and he's lost weight. And he says, oh, my God, you must have cancer. You're dying. It's like it can't be good either way. The negative thoughts are what's ruling. You know, so if you've gained weight, it's because you're a fat slob, and if you've lost weight, it's because you have cancer and you're dying, right? So there's no winning. So these negative thoughts can get triggered by certain events, like getting on a scale. When somebody criticizes us and we have a big emotional reaction to it, it's interesting to look at that maybe it's the way we think about ourselves. So to give you an example of this, we were doing an encounter group many years ago, and one of the men in the group got angry at one of the women in the group, and he was calling her every name in the book. I mean, the worst things you can imagine. Unrepeatable in a public dialogue here. But then he got to the word stupid. And she stood up, and she was ready to run out of the room. And why stupid after all those really mean, horrible things he had just said? Well, because that's how she feels about herself. That's her core negative thought about herself. So it isn't that it's true. She wasn't a stupid person, but she thought that about herself. So when somebody says a criticism that fits with the way we're criticizing ourselves, we tend to have a much bigger, much more dramatic reaction to that negative thought. So that's one way you can catch on to your critical inner voice. Also, we can look at the projections we make onto other people. When we think, especially that all the people at work think we're stupid, or no men are going to like us, or no women are going to think we're attractive, or we go into a new situation and we think nobody's going to want to talk to me at this party. When you're thinking everybody feels a certain way towards you, you're probably wrong, because there is no everybody. There's all the different individuals in that situation, or all the different men in the world, or all the different women in the world. Some might find you attractive, some might not. You know, I mean, it's a projection. And it's interesting because a number of years ago they did a research study where they asked people to write a description of themselves from the point of view of a mythical neighbor, a person they made up, not a real neighbor, but this person just watching their comings and goings who lived next door to them. And people made up very negative narratives of what people would think about them. And this was a complete projection, right, because this was a mythical neighbor. It wasn't a real person. But we tend to project our self-attacks onto other people and think other people think these bad things about us. We tend to do it, again, in the workplace. We tend to do it in our friendship circle. We tend to do it in our romantic relationships most particularly. We even sometimes do it with our own children, thinking that they think badly about us. And we can look for times when our mood changes, when our glass shifts from being half full to half empty. Like sometimes you can go to bed and feel pretty okay about your life and how things are going. And you wake up the next morning and nothing has changed, and you can feel really down about it. And like everything is terrible. Your job's terrible, your relationship's terrible, nobody cares about you. And it's like, whoa, what happened? Often it's because these critical inner thoughts somehow wove themselves into your dreams. So it's important to look at when your mood shifts. So if you're feeling pretty good at the beginning of the week and pretty awful by the end of the week, what happened? Trying to trace it back and not look at just what happened, but what were you telling yourself in those moments? What was going through your head? That's a way you can start to catch on to this critical inner voice. Now, I'm going to share with you some exercises that come from our book, Conquer Your Critical Inner Voice, for starting to identify this negative thought process. And the first one really has to do with how to think of your inner critic as an external enemy. So often we think these things as I statements. I'm no good. I'm unattractive. I'm different from other people. Nobody's going to like me. And they just seem like our point of view. But what we would suggest is that you put them as you statements instead. So you might have a thought like, I don't feel like I'm an attractive person. And instead, say it as you're not attractive. A lot of interesting things happen when you start to put this negative thought process in the second person. First of all, it helps to start to separate it from a more realistic, compassionate point of view about yourself. It also helps you start with kind of the surface, and often if you let that train of thought go, you'll get very quickly to more core negative thoughts about yourself. Also, you'll start to object to it more and want to take your own side, like, wait a minute, you can't talk to me like that. Because we talk to ourselves in ways we would never allow another person to talk to us, in ways we'd be very upset if somebody else talked to us. But we just kind of accept it from ourselves. So this can help you to start to understand it. It can help you to start to make sense of it, to start to separate from it. So it's journaling by putting down your negative thoughts that you have as I statements and switching them into the second person as you statements. It helps you separate your inner critic again from your real point of view. And it also allows you to think about, is this a point of view that reminds me of anybody from my past? What have I internalized? Where might this be coming from? And the idea here is not to establish blame. You know, I don't want to blame parents or anybody else, but it's to get some compassion for yourself. You didn't get this way from nowhere. It came from somewhere. And that's important in terms of having compassion for yourself. The next exercise has to do with responding rationally to your inner critic. So it's developing a more compassionate, realistic view of yourself. So first, you would write down your negative thoughts on one side of the page, and then you would answer back. So an example might be like, you're so stupid. And you might say something that's more realistic, like, sometimes I do struggle with work, but I catch on quickly, and I usually do a good job. You know, so something that's more balanced. It's not, you're stupid, no, I'm the smartest person in the world, because that probably isn't true either. But what's a realistic, balanced point of view about yourself, a compassionate point of view? What you would say to your friend who said this to you, what a friend would say to you about yourself. This is really important, and this is an ongoing journaling exercise where you take 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the end of the day, write down your negative thoughts on one side of the page, then come back to it and try to avoid a more realistic, compassionate point of view toward yourself. And there's also a plan of pleasurable activities. This comes from actually our chapter in Conquer Your Critical Inner Voice that's devoted to depression. And in our depression chapter, we have more exercises than in any other chapter. And we do that because it's really important to get doing things when you're depressed. And the last exercise of that chapter, which I think is chapter 10, is a plan of pleasurable activities. So it's thinking about activities that you're going to plan to engage in that you used to find pleasurable, and you may not now, but you want to act as if you do. You want to do them anyways. It's forcing yourself to go through the motions because this will start to bring you back to life and start to make you more identified with enjoying it. And then it's keeping a weekly report of what your critical inner voice is doing to try to talk you out of your plan to engage in pleasurable activities. Because when you start to take your own side and start to do more things and engage in more pleasurable activities, like going out to see a friend or going for a hike or going for a walk on the beach or whatever it might be, your inner critic is going to try to talk you out of it. Oh, you're too tired. You don't want to do that today. Oh, are you really up for this? It's going to say things to try to talk you out of going, and it's really important to stick with going. And I have 3 questions that have come in, so I want to address them, or actually 2. Can someone be depressed and not know it? Yes. Again, when we did depression screening day, we found a lot of people who were suffering symptoms that suggested by assessment that they had a serious major depression, didn't know it. One was a college student who had called home and was telling their parents something about their bad mood, and the parent was saying, oh yeah, everybody feels this when they first go to college. Oh yeah, it can be hard. But the parent wasn't getting it either, and probably because the student wasn't maybe giving them maybe the full details of how bad they were feeling. But they sort of shelved it and decided, okay, this is just the way all people feel. But no, this young person was experiencing a major depressive episode and could access very easily free counseling on campus that could be really helpful to them. And so we walked with them over to the counseling office and got them to that help. So people can be depressed and not really recognize that they're fully in the grips of a major depressive episode. They may just be believing their negative thoughts about themselves. Another question is, can you address depression in later life? I will address it a little bit, but all of what I'm saying is relevant to depression in later life. You know, often people think because they're in later life or they're older that you should feel depressed. That it is depressing to be old. And partly we do live in a culture that it has a lot of ageism. So older people are expected to give up things they used to love doing. When older people fall in love, we kind of make fun of it. But you know what? It's really important. Love and companionship is every bit as important when we're older as when we're young. And having fun and doing activities that we love is every bit as important when we're older as when we're young. It does become physically harder to engage in some of those activities, but keeping being physical is really important for those who are aging, both in terms of how your body's going to weather that aging, but also in terms of how your mind's going to weather that aging. It turns out physical activity is really important for your brain and your mind as well as for your body. So we do experience a lot of ageism in our society, but really valuing yourself and your knowledge that you've acquired and really finding things that give your life meaning and continuing to engage in those activities and not giving into the ageism of our society and giving up on yourself are really important, even when you're struggling with physical disabilities or things that may happen in later life. And one thing that's interesting is that we're incredibly adaptive creatures, human beings. We do a lot of different things and we can adapt to almost anything, but we have a hard time during transition periods while we're adapting. So when you lose a physical ability or lose a relationship or lose friends, as you do in later life because people you love may start dying, at first it feels like it's something you can never get over. And we often can get very depressed and even suicidal in those moments. But we can learn to live with almost anything. If you can get through the first 6 months, it turns out people do well. So while men are at more risk of dying in the 6 months after their wife dies, for instance, who are elder, if they can get through the 6 months, they usually do pretty well. If you lose a physical ability and you're very devastated by that, 6 months later you've usually adapted to it and found a way to have a meaningful life in spite of whatever that is. So it's really important to stick through it, to get the help and support you need to get through those first 6 months. So what we've been talking about is this self and this anti-self, here represented by characters from Where the Wild Things Are. We have Max here, and we have the monsters. And I think this is appropriate because when I heard the author interviewed about writing the book, Maurice Sendak, he talked about that he modeled the wildlings after his relatives, who would come over and pinch his cheek and say, "We'll eat you up, we love you so," and they terrified him as a child. He didn't know why his parents let these people in his house. But anyhow, when we give in to our critical inner voice, we feed this monster inside of us, this anti-self, and it takes more and more control over our behavior, and that's what's going on in depression. This anti-self, or these negative thoughts, are taking more and more control over our behavior, and the more we give in to them, the more helpless and hopeless and miserable our life seems. So what we need to do is to stand up to them, just like Max did at the end, toward the end of The Wild Things, where when he wanted to go, the monster said, "Don't go, we'll eat you up, we love you so." And he said, "No, I'm going." And when we take actions that are in our own self-interest, that go against our critical inner voices, we strengthen our sense of real self. Now, initially what happens is the voices get louder. The monster doesn't like being starved. It's going to throw a tantrum. Think of it that way. But the more you don't feed it and the more you don't feed it, it's going to get weaker and weaker and weaker. And it's going to take less control over your behavior. So you might still have the negative thought once in a while, but you're not going to feel like you have to act on it. So initially these thoughts do get louder when you act against them. So you want to take baby steps in moving away from them. And you want to know that you're going to feel anxious. Anxiety is part of any positive behavioral change. That's the rough part. And in our society, we tend to want to avoid anxiety. Makes you anxious, don't do it. Or let's take a pill and get rid of it. But anxiety is really important to recognize as a positive sign of changing. So you get into a new relationship. That's exciting, but you also feel anxious, right? Or let's say you are in a new job or in a higher position than you've ever been. You're going to feel some anxiety, but it's a part of this positive development in your life. Or going off to college makes us very anxious sometimes, first time being away from family, being in a situation where we feel called upon to be more independent and also more challenged by the work we're going to have to do. Makes us anxious, but if we can sweat through that anxiety, we're going to strengthen that sense of self. So again, not listening to these critical inner voices, recognizing when you're attacking yourself and not giving in to the behaviors that these negative thoughts are directing you to do is going to be an important part of getting over depression. Now, one way to do this is voice therapy. This is a methodology developed again by my father, Dr. Robert Firestone, and it's a cognitive affective behavioral approach. It's cognitive because we're focusing on the thoughts. It's affective because there's a lot of feeling behind these thoughts. These are not just an isolated intellectual thought process. There's a lot of feeling behind the thoughts, and it's really focused on shifting our behavior. Again, doing behaviors that are in our own self-interest and moving away from behaviors that are self-destructive or that undermine us. And he originally wrote about this, and this is a picture of him, in his book, Voice Therapy, a psychological approach to self-destructive behavior. Now, we've had an e-course about this recently, and that is accessible to you. It started in September, but you can access it at any time and begin the course on how to overcome your inner critic, how to free yourself from imagined limitations. It's a 6-week e-course where you get multimedia presentations and introductions each week, an intention to hold, exercises to do, a discussion forum where you can hear how other people have experienced it and questions they've asked. If you want to learn more about this, go to psychalive.org. And I'm going to share with you 8 ways to actively fight depression that are really important. One is to recognize and conquer your critical self-attacks, to really recognize the ways that you're attacking yourself, both in a self-critical way and in a self-soothing way, undermining your life, and how to take actions to go against those. So that's the first step. It's important to think about what you could be angry at. One thing is anger is a very confused emotion, and my father just wrote about a blog about this that we just published, I think today, or we're going to be publishing today on our PsychoLive website about anger and how to handle anger, because anger is a very misunderstood emotion. It often gets labeled as a negative emotion, like it's bad and we shouldn't have it, but it is a natural part of our emotional repertoire. When we're frustrated, we feel angry. Now, you may be wanting to drive somewhere in a hurry and somebody is very slowly walking across the street in front of you, you're going to feel frustrated and you're going to feel angry. Now, that's not rational or justified. It's just how you're going to feel. And you could feel as angry as you want. You could have a fantasy of running the person over. But it's really important that our behavior, on the other hand, be rational. And of course, you wouldn't even start into the intersection as the person is crossing. You would wait patiently because that person needs the time, right? So your behavior has to be based on reality and on moral considerations. But your feelings are not. You can fully feel the feeling of anger without hurting anybody. But it's important to have full access to our feelings and be able to feel them and then decide how we want to behave. To have that pause button to think about moral considerations and reality considerations of what we really want to do. But anger is not a negative emotion. It's really important to feel it. But often when we don't feel our anger in a situation where we're very angry, we turn it against ourselves. And we can get physically somatic and we can get depressed. So a lot of depression is about repressing feelings. It's not about feeling so many feelings. It's about repressing feelings and feeling the pain and agony of doing that. It's important to be physically active. There was a study that just was published recently that shows that exercise is as effective as antidepressants. So isn't that amazing that physical activity, being physically active, is hugely important if you're depressed. And there's the most data or evidence about aerobic activity, anything that gets your heart going. And it's important to do that at least 20 minutes a day for at least 5 days a week. Now, if you do it 35 minutes a day for 7 days a week, that's better. It's great if you can do it outside because nature is also calming to us. A run on the beach may be perfect because also being around water is very calming to us, but you may not live in an area where you have the ocean or a lake easily available or, you know, a beautiful hill like the one you're seeing here. I'm very lucky because I live in Santa Barbara, so I have a lot of that available to me. But just even going to the gym or even doing jumping jacks in your living room or jump roping can be really important for getting yourself feeling less depressed. I call this physical therapy for depression. It's really important to be active. And even when you don't feel like it, to force yourself through the steps of being active. Don't isolate yourself. Isolation feeds the critical inner voice. It is the worst thing you can do for yourself. It's how people spiral into a much more dangerous state. So it's really important to at least go in public places and be around other people who will distract you from these negative thoughts, even if it just means going to the local coffee place or a sporting event where there's a lot of other people around and it's hard to get into your head too much. But having close contact with friends, just talking to people that you like and who will distract you. You don't even have to talk to them about the depression, but just that will bring up your mood. And really seeking out those people who you feel the most yourself and the best around. Really, really important for that to be part of your action plan. And again, planning to do things you once liked to do. Don't force yourself to do things you used to hate to do. If you hated cooking, for instance, it's not that to force yourself to do more cooking, but if you love dancing and going out dancing, do more of that. Do the thing you used to love to do, the thing that lit you up. If getting dressed up used to make you feel good and now you're just not caring, go ahead and get dressed up. It'll make you feel better. Even though it might not feel like it at first, this is acting as if it's okay. It's okay to fake it till you make it. Watch a funny TV show or movie, something that makes you laugh. Laughing tells our brain that we're happy. Just smiling tells our brain that we're happy. So go be around kids or babies that make you smile. You will feel better. Watch something that makes you laugh. Listen to something funny on the radio. Listening to music from a happy time of your life will induce a happy mood. What you want to stay away from is depressing music or music from a depressing time in your life. And don't punish yourself or beat yourself up for feeling bad and feel like you're a bad person or you should just be able to snap out of it. You can't just snap yourself out of a depression. You may want to, but it doesn't work that way. It's really important to take these active steps and to get the help you need. And it's really important not to see it as a negative to reach out to a therapist. You need help and support. If you were struggling with a physical condition, would you not go to the doctor? Would you not seek out the help you needed? This is the same thing. When you need help or assistance, go for it. And if you need help finding a therapist, there's a great, on the American Psychological Association website, they can help link you to that. You can find that on our PsychAlive website. And if medication is indicated, take your medication. It will help you. Again, it may provide the training wheels for you to get going and get back on your own side. And there's some new medications that they're finding that have amazing effects on even changing your brain. And antidepressants in general increase the neuroplasticity of your brain or the ability of your brain to change, as do some of the psychotherapies. So it's really important that you're actually literally rewiring your brain by engaging in therapy with a therapist or by taking the medications. You're going to increase your chances of getting better. And rumination, or letting these negative thoughts take hold, is the most negative thing you can do. In a 2013 study of more than 30,000 people showed that harping on negative self-events, particularly through rumination and self-blame, can be the prime predictor of some of today's most common mental health problems like anxiety and depression. So if you find yourself spending a lot of the day thinking negative things about yourself and ruminating on them, that's another thing that isolation feeds. This is very destructive. You need to break out of this. Even if you can limit the amount of time that you're going to worry or think about your negative thoughts to 15 minutes 3 times a day, you're going to feel a heck of a lot better. One thing they found is if you can reduce the amount of time that you think about negative thoughts, even suicidal thoughts, it turns out the less likely you are to actually engage in self-destructive or suicidal behavior. So it's really important to limit your time ruminating. So here's some guidelines for continued personal development. Be aware that fear is going to accompany change, that you're going to feel anxious. That's not a bad sign. It means you're on the right track. Realize that your psychological pain is valid, that your feelings are valid. They're how you feel. Develop a more realistic view of your parents. Your parents were probably not monsters, but they weren't angels either. They were real people with mixed feelings about themselves. And when you can develop a more realistic point of view about your parents, it's really important, because often we idealize our parents and we feel like we were the bad kid. And we grow up still feeling like that bad kid. It's more important to see your parents realistically as having positives and negative traits, and also yourself realistically. And we have some exercises that address this and conquer your critical inner voice as well. It's important to differentiate, to separate yourself from identities that you took on in your family and your community, and to unlearn old behaviors or adaptations you made to those situations, which might have been the absolute best adaptation at the time, but that aren't helping you in your adult life. And in your adult life, you need to learn new behaviors that are more true to who you want to be. So if there's somebody you really like or admire, how could you be more like that person? What could you do to make yourself a person that you really like and admire? It's important to challenge specific defenses that we have against feeling. How do we keep our feelings down, particularly our anger, but other, quotes, negative feelings that we then internalize and direct toward ourselves? So do we engage in addictive behaviors to try to get rid of those feelings, or do we try to cut ourselves off by watching 3 million hours of TV? So it's really important to challenge our defenses against feeling, because when we can feel all our feelings, we're going to feel less depressed. And to recognize the value of friendship. Building a support team with other people who are going to help you really matters. Really give your friendships value and the time that they deserve. And it's important to seek your own personal meaning in life. It turns out that if we try to seek happiness, we don't get happier. We can't just chase happiness, but if we chase meaning, things that make us feel really good about ourselves, that give us meaning, that give us some sense of purpose in the world, we get happier. And the only really appropriate attitude toward yourself is what Dan Siegel calls a Cole attitude, and he loves acronyms. Dan Siegel's in the forefront of a field called interpersonal neurobiology. We're actually going to be doing an upcoming webinar with him about parenting and discipline. But I love this acronym of his the most. Curious, open, accepting, and loving. That's the only appropriate attitude to have toward yourself. Even if you've done something really bad or you're really struggling, be curious about it. Be open, be accepting, and loving. You're much more likely to make the right choice and do the right thing if you take this attitude toward yourself. And it's really important to develop self-compassion, even more than self-esteem. And self-compassion is not based on a self-evaluation. People feel compassion for themselves because all human beings deserve compassion and understanding, and because they possess some particular, not because they possess some particular sets of traits, but you deserve compassion just because you're a human being. And research indicates that in comparison to self-esteem, self-compassion is associated with greater emotional resilience, more accurate self-concept, more caring relationships with other people, and also more caring behavior, as well as less narcissism and reactive anger. So what you want to cultivate is self-compassion. You might want to look at the work of Dr. Christine Neff on developing self-compassion. And another way to do it is through compassion meditation, which has also been found to make people feel happier and better about themselves, more compassionate toward self and toward others. One more thing from Dan Siegel, the Healthy Mind Platter. These are the 7 things we need to do every day to have a healthy mind. So you might want to think about whether you're doing these things. We need time to sleep. Turns out it's really important for our brain. We need time to be physical, again, ideally outdoors, but at least being physical and active is really important. We are naturally active creatures. We need some focus time to learn something new. You may have focus time at work or at school, or even paying attention to this webinar today was a focus time. Some time in where we're checking in with what's going on inside of us. What are we feeling? What's going on inside our body? This could be done through meditation or other ways. And one thing I would suggest if you're interested in meditation is Headspace. They have what they call 10 for 10, which is 10 minutes a day for 10 days for free of leading you through some meditation. And it really makes some good metaphors so you understand the idea of checking in with yourself and your body. Some downtime where we're doing nothing. This is the one I don't do so well on, but it's really important. Some playtime where we're having fun. Again, that laughing, smiling tells our brain we're happy. And some connecting time with other people, preferably in person. And by phone is better than text, it turns out, because when we hear somebody's voice, it sets off neurochemicals in our brain like we are really relating to them in a way that text does not. But if online and text is all the only way we can do it, at least connecting online turns out to be really important. So all of these things need to be part of our everyday to have a healthy mind. And just a few more things. It's important to practice being generous in all your relationships. Giving makes us feel good about ourselves. So here we're talking about generosity not as a moral principle, but as a mental health principle. It'll make you feel good about yourself. Becoming aware of existential realities is important because those affect us, and they make us feel sad, but poignant feelings, like they give our life real meaning, the limited amount of time that we may have. And developing our own spiritual perspective and appreciating the mystery of our existence, that meaning in life, turns out to be really an important part of feeling good about ourselves. And I'd like to end with this quote from Albert Einstein. A human being is a part of a whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. Nobody is able to achieve this completely, but the striving for such achievement is in itself a part of a liberation and a foundation for inner security. So this idea of having compassion for all living things is really important. Here's some of our resources and books. I mentioned Conquer Our Critical Inner Voice and Voice Therapy. Our most recent book is also The Self Under Siege, which talks a lot about how to differentiate yourself or become your true self. We have some upcoming webinars. We have one on Changeology that's tailoring your therapy to stages of change, presented by John Norcross, and this is a CE webinar for professionals, and also one that people can take for free. You can get 2 CE credits, or I guess the non-CE price is $15. I'll read the slide better. Then we have our Narcissism from Healthy to Pathological webinar, and that's coming up in December. And again, you can get CEs for it for $35 or just $15 if you just want to take it for your own personal interest. You can see on our website, PsychOlive, a full list of the webinars we have coming up. We also have a weekend workshop retreat coming up very soon, November 7th through 9th in Ojai, California. How to free yourself from your inner critic. If you want to learn more or want to register, you can go to glendon.org. And if you want to contact us, here's our contact information again. And thank you for joining me for this webinar. I really appreciate your attention to this very important subject, and I hope it's been helpful to you. And with that, I'm going to end the webinar.